I was standing at my kitchen window, watching the sunrise over Flathead Lake in Montana, when I noticed something that made my coffee mug freeze halfway to my lips. There were construction workers drilling into the ice that covered my private cove, and a woman in a purple parka was directing them with the authority of someone who believed she owned the world. My name is Grant Owens, and I had spent the last 3 winters carefully managing this cove on my lakefront property. Every November, when temperatures dropped, I would monitor the ice formation, check its thickness daily, and use it as my personal skating rink. It was one of the main reasons I bought this property 5 years ago. The cove was entirely within my property lines, extending about 200 feet from my shoreline. I had the surveys, the deeds, everything documented. I threw on my jacket and boots and trudged down the snow-covered slope to the frozen cove. The woman in the purple parka turned as I approached, and I immediately recognized her. Debra Patterson. She had moved into the neighborhood last spring and somehow gotten herself elected as president of the Lakeview Estates HOA within 2 months. I was not part of the HOA. My property predated the development by 15 years, and I had explicitly refused to join when they formed it 3 years ago. "Excuse me," I called out, my breath forming clouds in the frigid January air. "What exactly is going on here?" Debra turned to face me with that smile that never quite reached her eyes. She was probably in her late 40s, with blonde highlights that looked professionally done, and the kind of yoga-toned physique that came from having too much free time. "Good morning, Grant. We're installing the foundation posts for the Lakeview Estates Curling Club. Isn't it exciting?" I stared at her. "This is my property." "Actually," she said, pulling out a folder from a bag one of the workers was holding, "if you look at the community charter, all lake access within the development boundaries is considered common area for recreational use." "I'm not in your development," I said, keeping my voice level. "This cove is entirely on my deed. You're trespassing." She gave me that condescending look that I would come to know very well. "Grant, I understand you're upset about not being included in the planning process, but the HOA board voted unanimously on this. The curling club will bring so much value to our community. Property values will increase. We've already had inquiries from the Montana Curling Association about hosting tournaments." "Get off my ice," I said. One of the construction workers, a guy in his 30s with a thick beard, looked uncomfortable. "Madam, if there's a property dispute, maybe we should wait until it's resolved." Debra's smile vanished. "You're being paid to work, not to give legal advice. The HOA's lawyer reviewed everything. We have every right to be here." I pulled out my phone and called the Flathead County Sheriff's Office. Within 20 minutes, a deputy arrived. His name was Mike Crawford, and I had met him a few times at the local hardware store. He looked over my property documents, then at the HOA's papers that Debra thrust at him. "Madam," Deputy Crawford said, "his deed clearly shows this cove is on his property. The HOA boundaries stop at the edge of his lot line. You need to cease work immediately." Debra's face turned an impressive shade of red. "This is ridiculous. We've already paid for the materials and the construction permits." "Then you should have verified property ownership before you started," the deputy said. "If you continue, Mr. Owens can press charges for trespassing and vandalism." The construction crew packed up quickly after that, but as they left, Debra turned to me with a look of pure malice. "This isn't over, Grant. The HOA has resources, and we will find a way to make this curling club happen. It's for the good of the community." "It's my property," I repeated. "Find somewhere else." Over the next week, I thought the matter was settled. I went back to my routine as a freelance software developer, working from my home office with its spectacular view of the lake. Then the letters started arriving. The first was a formal notice from the HOA's legal team, Peterson and Associates out of Kalispell. They claimed that my property, while not technically part of the HOA, was still subject to certain covenants due to its location within the greater Lakeview community boundaries. It was complete nonsense, but it was nonsense printed on expensive letterhead. I called my own lawyer, a woman named Sarah Chen who had handled my property purchase. She read the letter over the phone and actually laughed. "This is absurd. They have no legal standing whatsoever. But responding to this kind of frivolous claim will cost you about $1,500 in legal fees. That's probably their strategy. Bury you in legal costs until you give in. So what do I do? Ignore it for now. If they actually file a lawsuit, which I doubt they will because they'd lose immediately, then we'll respond. In the meantime, document everything. Every interaction, every letter, every incident." The second letter arrived 3 days later. This one claimed that my property was in violation of community aesthetic standards because I had not painted my house within the approved color palette. My house was a beautiful natural wood exterior that I had just restored last summer. Again, I was not part of their HOA and owed them nothing. Then came the phone calls. Debra called me at 7 in the morning, 9 at night, on weekends, each time with some new complaint or demand. My dock was extending too far into the lake. My outdoor lights were too bright. My truck was parked in a way that was visually disruptive to the neighborhood harmony. I started letting her calls go to voicemail. That's when she showed up at my door. It was a Saturday morning in late January. I had just finished my coffee and was about to head down to the ice to check its condition. I opened the door to find Debra standing there with 2 other women I recognized from the neighborhood. "Grant," Debra said in a voice that was trying very hard to sound friendly, "we need to talk about a compromise." "There's nothing to compromise about. It's my property." The woman on her left, a thin brunette whose name I later learned was Patricia, spoke up. "We're prepared to offer you compensation. $5,000 for seasonal use of the cove for curling activities." I almost laughed. "No, 10,000, Debra said quickly. "It's not about money. The answer is no. The ice on that cove isn't even thick enough or smooth enough for curling. You need at least 8 inches of consistent ice and regular maintenance. What you're proposing is dangerous and stupid." The third woman, older with gray hair, gave me a pitying look. "You're being very selfish. Think about what this club could mean for families in the area. For children who want to learn a new sport. Then they can join one of the 3 curling clubs already operating in the Flathead Valley. Now get off my porch." Debra's mask slipped completely. "You're going to regret this. The HOA has ways of dealing with difficult people." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm stating facts. Life can be very uncomfortable for people who don't cooperate with community standards." I closed the door in her face. Through the window, I watched them walk back to Debra's pristine white SUV, and I had a sinking feeling that this was far from over. I was right. 2 days later, I discovered that someone had filed a complaint with the county about my septic system, claiming it was leaking into the lake. An inspector had to come out, which cost me a day of work and $300 for the inspection fee. The system was perfect, of course. It had been inspected and upgraded just 2 years ago. The following week, someone reported me to the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks for allegedly harassing waterfowl. A game warden showed up to investigate. I had to explain that the ducks and geese on my property were completely wild and unbothered, as evidenced by the fact that they kept returning every day. Then my mailbox was knocked over. My trash cans were tipped over twice. Someone left a bag of dog feces on my doorstep. I installed security cameras, 2 at the front of the house, 2 at the back, and 2 covering the path down to the cove. The footage I got was enlightening. At 11:30 on a Thursday night, I watched as 3 figures approached my property. They were dressed in dark clothes, but when they passed under my motion-activated lights, I got clear shots of their faces. One was Debra's husband, Michael Patterson. The other 2 were neighbors I recognized but didn't know by name. They walked down to the ice with what looked like spray paint cans. Over the course of 20 minutes, they spray-painted messages across my frozen cove. Selfish jerk. Community hater. Share the lake. I saved the footage and called Deputy Crawford in the morning. He came out, looked at the video, looked at the vandalism, and shook his head. "I can arrest them for criminal mischief and trespassing," he said. "But fair warning, this is going to make your situation with the HOA a lot worse. It can't get much worse. They're already harassing me constantly." "Your call, Mr. Owens." I pressed charges. Michael Patterson and the 2 other men, whose names turned out to be Robert Chen and David Martinez, were arrested that afternoon. They each faced misdemeanor charges with maximum penalties of 6 months in jail and $1,000 fines. Debra showed up at my house that evening. This time she wasn't trying to be polite. "How dare you have my husband arrested?" she screamed from my driveway. "I didn't open the door. He was standing up for the community. You've turned everyone against you with your selfishness. Do you know what people are saying about you? Get off my property or I'm calling the sheriff again. You can't hide behind the law forever. The HOA will make your life hell. We'll tie you up in litigation for years. We'll make sure everyone in this valley knows what kind of person you are." I recorded the whole thing on my phone from the window. When she finally left, I sent the video to my lawyer with a note about considering a restraining order. Sarah Chen called me back within an hour. "Grant, this has escalated beyond a simple property dispute. This woman is actively harassing you. I think we need to consider a civil suit against the HOA for harassment and to file for a restraining order against Mrs. Patterson." "Will that stop them?" "It should. And it'll cost them a lot of money to defend. Right now, they think they can bully you into submission because you're one person against an organization. We need to show them there are consequences." We filed both the next day. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out, but the civil suit was a longer process. Sarah estimated it could take 6 months or more to get to court, but the act of filing it would send a message. During this time, something interesting happened. A few of my neighbors, ones who lived in the HOA development but were apparently not fans of Debra's leadership, started reaching out to me. The first was a man named Tom Williams who lived 3 houses down from the entrance to the development. He knocked on my door on a Sunday afternoon, looking nervous. "Mr. Owens, I hope I'm not intruding. I just wanted to say that not everyone in the HOA supports what Debra has been doing. There's a group of us who think she's gone way too far." I invited him in for coffee. Tom was in his 60s, retired from a career in education, and he explained that Debra had taken control of the HOA through what he called aggressive parliamentary procedure and intimidation. She stacks meetings with her supporters, changes meeting times without proper notice, and pushes through votes before anyone can properly review proposals. This curling club thing is just her latest obsession. Last year she tried to mandate that everyone plant the same type of flowers in their front yards. Before that, she wanted to ban pickup trucks from being parked in driveways because they weren't aesthetically pleasing. "Why doesn't someone run against her?" I asked. Tom sighed. "People are afraid of her. She's vindictive. Anyone who crosses her finds themselves drowning in violation notices and fines. She fined one family $200 because their Christmas lights were up until January 3rd. He gave me his phone number and told me that if I needed any support or witnesses to the HOA's behavior, he and several others would be willing to help. It was reassuring to know I wasn't completely alone in this. The restraining order hearing came in mid-February. The judge, a stern woman in her 50s named Judge Martinez, reviewed my evidence including the videos, the harassment, and the documented pattern of behavior. Debra showed up with the HOA's lawyer, a slick guy in an expensive suit named Richard Patterson. Patterson argued that Debra was simply trying to fulfill her duties as HOA president, and that any communication she had with me was legitimate HOA business. The judge was not impressed. "Mr. Patterson, your client showed up at Mr. Owens' home at 9 at night to scream at him. She has called him upwards of 40 times in a month. She has threatened him with legal action despite having no legal standing. This is textbook harassment." The restraining order was granted. Debra had to stay at least 500 feet away from me and my property and could not contact me directly by any means. Any HOA business had to go through lawyers. I thought that might finally end it. I was wrong. In late February, when the ice was at its thickest and most beautiful, I woke up one morning to the sound of machinery. I looked out my window and felt my stomach drop. There were construction vehicles on the lake ice again, but this time they weren't on my cove. They were right at the edge of it, just barely on the HOA's side of the property line. I pulled on my clothes and headed down. A full construction crew was setting up what looked like a regulation curling rink. They had already installed boards to form the playing surface, and they were laying down piping and equipment to maintain the ice. Debra was there, staying carefully 500 feet away but watching with a triumphant smile. The HOA's lawyer, Patterson, was with her. I called my lawyer immediately. Sarah showed up within an hour, and we walked the property line carefully with the surveyor maps on my phone. They were just barely on the HOA side, maybe 6 inches from my property line. "They can't stop us from building on HOA property," Patterson called out from his safe distance. "And once the curling club is operational, Mr. Owens will realize what a wonderful addition it is to the community." The problem became apparent over the next few days. A regulation curling sheet is about 146 feet long and 15 feet wide. Even with the smaller recreational version they were building, they needed ice space that extended into my cove to actually play. The stones would slide right across the property line. The Friday before they planned to open the facility, Debra sent a formal letter through her lawyer requesting an easement for sporting equipment that would allow curling stones to cross into my property during play. The letter suggested that I was being unreasonable and that any judge would see the request as logical and fair. Sarah's response was simple: denied. On Saturday, February 28th, the Lakeview Estates Curling Club had its grand opening. About 30 people showed up, bundled in winter gear, excited to try out the new facility. I watched from my window as they gathered on the ice, as Debra gave what looked like a speech, and as the first players prepared to throw their stones. The first stone was released. It slid down the ice, crossing the property line onto my cove by about 10 feet before coming to rest. A cheer went up from the crowd. I walked down to the ice. "That stone is on my property," I said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Remove it immediately." Debra was staying back due to the restraining order, but one of her supporters, a man I didn't recognize, spoke up. "Don't be ridiculous. It's just a game. The stone will be retrieved in a minute. It's trespassing. Remove it now or I will." Several people started arguing with me. Someone called me a fun hater. Someone else said I was ruining a wholesome community activity. A few people looked uncomfortable but didn't speak up. I pulled out my phone and called the sheriff's office. Deputy Crawford showed up for what felt like the 100th time in 2 months. "Folks," he said tiredly, "if the stones are crossing onto private property without permission, you can't play here. Simple as that." "This is absurd," one woman shouted. "It's a 42-pound rock sliding across ice. What harm is it doing?" "It's the principle of property rights," Crawford said. "You wouldn't want people throwing things into your yard, would you?" The grand opening turned into a shouting match. Eventually people dispersed, angry and disappointed. As I walked back to my house, I heard someone say, "He's going to pay for this." That night, I lay in bed thinking about the situation. They had spent probably $50,000 building this facility. They weren't going to just give up. And I realized that as long as the ice remained in good condition, this fight would continue. I thought about the curling stones themselves. 42 pounds of polished granite, specially made in Scotland or Wales, worth hundreds of dollars each. The HOA had purchased a full set, probably 8 to 16 stones. What would happen, I wondered, if the ice surface where those stones landed was compromised? The idea formed slowly, like frost on a window. It was petty, sure, maybe even destructive, but I was tired. Tired of the harassment, the legal fees, the constant stress. They had built their facility knowing it couldn't function without using my property. They had gambled that I would eventually cave to social pressure or legal pressure. They had gambled wrong. I spent Sunday researching. The ice on my cove was currently about 12 inches thick, more than enough to support vehicles. But ice is tricky. It doesn't melt evenly. If you apply heat to a specific area, you can create weak spots while leaving surrounding ice intact. My house had a radiant heating system that I had installed for the driveway to prevent ice buildup. The system used a network of tubes filled with heated water, running off my boiler. I had leftover materials from that installation in my garage, including about 200 feet of tubing and a pump system. On Monday morning, when everyone was at work, I started my project. I worked in the specific zone of my cove where the curling stones would land, roughly 10 to 20 feet from the property line. I cut holes through the ice and ran heating tubes underneath it at a depth of about 6 inches. The tubes formed a grid pattern about 20 feet wide and 30 feet long. It took me 3 days to complete the installation, working mostly at night to avoid attention. I connected everything to a control system in my garage that would let me regulate the water temperature. The beauty of the system was that, from the surface, you couldn't tell anything had changed. The ice looked perfect. On Thursday, I got the message I had been waiting for. Tom Williams called to let me know that the HOA had announced another curling event for Saturday. They were calling it a community bonding day and were encouraging everyone to come try the new facility. Friday night, I activated the heating system. I set it to run warm, not hot. I didn't want to completely melt the ice, just weaken it significantly in that specific zone. The goal was to create ice that looked solid but had the structural integrity of honeycomb. Saturday morning arrived clear and cold. Perfect curling weather, or so they thought. I watched from my window as people gathered at the facility. There were maybe 40 people this time, including what looked like a local news crew. Debra must have invited them to document her triumph. The first few stones were thrown from the HOA side, crossing the property line as expected. They slid across the ice normally, and the players seemed thrilled. Then they went to retrieve the stones. The first person to walk onto my section of ice was a teenager, probably 16 or 17. He took 2 steps onto the weakened ice and immediately crashed through with a tremendous crack. The ice gave way beneath him, plunging him into the frigid water up to his chest. People screamed. Several others rushed forward to help, and they broke through too. The ice was failing in chunks now, pieces of it bobbing in the dark water. Within seconds, there were 5 people in the water, thrashing and panicking. I was already moving, grabbing the emergency rope and life preservers I kept for lake safety. I ran down to the cove, my heart pounding. Whatever satisfaction I had been planning to feel was gone, replaced by pure adrenaline and fear. People could die from cold water shock in minutes. "Stay calm," I yelled. "Don't try to climb back onto the ice, it won't hold you. Grab onto the edge and wait." I threw life preservers to the closest victims. Tom Williams and a few others had the presence of mind to form a human chain from the solid ice, pulling people out one by one. The teenager was first, his lips already blue, teeth chattering violently. Emergency services arrived within 8 minutes. Paramedics wrapped people in warming blankets and checked for hypothermia. Miraculously, everyone would be okay. The water temperature was just above freezing, and the response had been fast enough to prevent serious harm. But several of the HOA's expensive curling stones had gone straight to the bottom of the lake, probably 40 feet down in the deepest part of the cove. I watched divers later trying to locate them, but the bottom was silty, and finding 42-pound rocks in that much water was nearly impossible. Deputy Crawford pulled me aside while the paramedics were working. "Grant, I need to ask you something. This ice was fine yesterday according to multiple witnesses. Now there's a section that completely failed. What happened?" I showed him the heating system. There was no point lying. The equipment was right there in my garage, running. His face went through several expressions as I explained. "You deliberately weakened the ice knowing people would walk on it." "I weakened the ice on my property to prevent people from trespassing. I didn't invite anyone onto my property. I didn't authorize anyone to walk on my ice. They did that despite being told repeatedly to stay off. People could have died." "I know." The weight of that hit me hard. "I didn't think anyone would actually walk out there. I thought the stones would just fall through." "But you must have known someone would go after the stones." I didn't have a good answer for that. The truth was, I had been so focused on sabotaging their curling club that I had not thought through the logical conclusion. Of course, someone would walk onto the ice to retrieve expensive equipment. Of course, they would assume the ice was safe because it looked safe. Crawford looked at me for a long moment. "I'm going to have to write this up. The county attorney is going to want to review it. You might be facing reckless endangerment charges." My stomach dropped. "I understand." The news crew that had come to cover the curling club's opening instead got footage of a rescue operation. By Saturday evening, the story was on every local news channel. "HOA ice facility turns dangerous," read one headline. "Multiple people fall through lake ice at new curling club," read another. What the news stories revealed was interesting. Several reporters dug into the background of the facility and discovered that the HOA had never gotten proper permits for construction on the lake. They had filed for a permit to build a recreational ice rink, but had not specified that it was on frozen lake ice, which required additional environmental reviews. The county had assumed they were building on land. The Montana Department of Environmental Quality launched an investigation. It turned out that the piping and equipment the HOA had installed to maintain the ice included refrigerants that were not approved for use in proximity to natural water sources. If those systems leaked, they could contaminate the lake. On Monday, I received notice that I needed to appear at the county attorney's office for an interview regarding the incident. Sarah Chen accompanied me. The county attorney was a serious man in his 40s named James Mitchell. "Mr. Owens," he said, I've reviewed Deputy Crawford's report. You deliberately created a hazardous condition on your property, and 5 people were injured as a result. They were trespassing, I said. I had told them repeatedly to stay off my property. You had a responsibility to ensure your property was not unreasonably dangerous. If someone is walking on what appears to be solid ice, they have a reasonable expectation that it will support their weight, especially in late February when ice is typically at its thickest. Sarah spoke up. My client had no way of knowing people would walk onto that specific area. He had posted no trespassing signs. He had verbally warned people multiple times. The HOA chose to build a facility that could not function without trespassing on private property. My client was trying to protect that property by creating a death trap, by making use of his own property as he saw fit. If someone jumped my client's fence and fell into his pool, would he be liable? A pool is clearly visible. This was ice that looked safe but wasn't. The interview went on for 2 hours. Mitchell was clearly wrestling with how to handle the situation. On one hand, I had created a dangerous condition. On the other hand, the people who were hurt were actively trespassing after being warned multiple times. In the end, Mitchell decided not to file criminal charges against me, but he issued a stern warning. Mr. Owens, you're lucky no one died. If anyone had, we would be having a very different conversation. I'm declining to prosecute, but I'm also ordering you to dismantle that heating system immediately and post clear warning signs about thin ice. I agreed. I was so relieved to avoid criminal charges that I would have agreed to almost anything, but the story wasn't over. In fact, it was about to take several more turns. The parents of the teenager who had fallen through first filed a civil lawsuit against both me and the HOA. They claimed their son had suffered psychological trauma from the incident and was now afraid of ice and water. They were seeking damages of $500,000. The other 4 people who had fallen through also filed suits. Within 2 weeks, I was facing potential liability of over $2 million. Sarah filed counterclaims against the HOA, arguing that they were the primary responsible party for creating the hazardous situation by building a facility that encouraged people to trespass on my property. She also filed additional harassment claims based on the entire pattern of behavior over the previous 3 months. The HOA, meanwhile, was facing its own legal nightmare. The families who had fallen through were suing them as well. The State Environmental Agency had issued violations and fines totaling over $80,000. And several HOA members were now filing complaints that they had never properly authorized the spending for the curling club. It turned out that Debra had pushed through the funding for the project without properly following the HOA's bylaws. She was supposed to get approval from at least 75% of the membership for any expenditure over $25,000. The curling club had cost nearly $60,000 when all was said and done, and she had gotten approval from only her board of directors, not the full membership. Tom Williams and a group of other homeowners called for a special meeting to vote on Debra's removal as president. The meeting was scheduled for late March, and the tension in the community was apparently at an all-time high. I received a surprising phone call in mid-March. It was Michael Patterson, Debra's husband. He asked if we could meet in person. I agreed, curious, and we met at a coffee shop in Kalispell, well away from our neighborhood. Michael looked exhausted. He was probably in his early 50s with graying hair and the kind of stress lines that came from months of conflict. "I need to apologize," he said once we sat down, "for vandalizing your property, for everything. Debra has been impossible to live with through all of this, and I got caught up in her obsession. Why are you telling me this? because I want this to end. The legal fees are destroying us. Debra won't admit it, but we're going to have to sell our house to pay for all of this. The HOA's insurance won't cover most of the claims because Debra acted outside her authority. We're personally liable for a lot of it. He pulled out a folder. I'm prepared to testify about everything. How Debra falsified documents to make it look like she had authorization for the curling club. How she told the construction crew to start work on your property hoping you wouldn't notice until it was too late. How she organized the harassment campaign against you. Why would you testify against your wife? Because I want a divorce, and I want to make it clear that this was her crusade, not mine. I know that sounds selfish, but I can't let her take me down with her. I took the folder. Inside were emails, text messages, and HOA documents that showed a clear pattern of Debra acting unilaterally, forging approvals, and deliberately targeting me for harassment. There were messages where she talked about making my life hell and ensuring I learned what happens to people who don't cooperate. There's something else, Michael said. When the heating system you installed was discovered, Debra talked about filing criminal charges against you. But before she could, she came up with a different plan. She was going to tamper with the ice again, this time on the HOA side, and make it look like you had expanded your sabotage. She wanted to escalate things so much that you would be arrested. She was going to frame me. Yes. I talked her out of it, but barely. That's when I knew I had to get out. I thanked him for the information and immediately took it to Sarah. She reviewed everything with increasing amazement. "This is gold," she said. "This shows a pattern of malicious behavior that goes way beyond a property dispute. We can use this to get all the civil suits against you dismissed and to hold Debra and the HOA board personally liable for everything." The special HOA meeting to vote on Debra's removal took place on March 23rd. I wasn't a member, so I couldn't attend, but Tom Williams called me afterwards to fill me in. "It was brutal," he said. Debra tried to maintain control, but once Michael's testimony was read along with all those documents, the room turned on her. People were furious. Families who had been fined and harassed over the years all spoke up. The vote wasn't even close. She was removed as president by a 92% vote. What happens now? The HOA is essentially bankrupt. We'll have to levy a special assessment on all the homes to pay for the legal settlements and cleanup. Everyone is pretty angry about that. There's talk of dissolving the HOA entirely and just converting to a loose neighborhood association with no enforcement power. The civil lawsuits were consolidated into one case that went to mediation in late April. The mediator was a retired judge named Herbert Stone, who had a reputation for cutting through nonsense. After hearing from all parties, Judge Stone made his position clear. The HOA and its former president acted recklessly and maliciously in creating this situation. Mr. Owens acted recklessly in his response to that situation. The families who were injured were put in danger by the combined actions of both parties, but primarily by the HOA's decision to build a facility that required trespassing on private property. His proposed settlement was that the HOA and Debra personally would pay 75% of the damages to the injured families, and I would pay 25%. The total damages were negotiated down to $600,000, which meant I was on the hook for $150,000. It was a huge amount of money, but Sarah advised me to take it. If this goes to trial, a jury might decide you're more liable because you actually created the weak ice. This settlement at least limits your exposure. I agreed. The HOA had to levy an assessment of $4,000 per household to cover their portion, which did not make me popular with my neighbors, even those who had not been on Debra's side. My own payment took nearly all my savings and required me to take out a home equity loan. Debra and Michael's divorce proceeded quickly. As part of the settlement, Michael agreed to testify fully about Debra's actions, and in exchange, he was released from most of the personal liability. Debra, on the other hand, faced the full weight of her decisions. In June, the Montana Attorney General's office opened an investigation into whether Debra had committed fraud in her handling of HOA funds. The investigation revealed that she had not only acted without proper authorization, but had also diverted nearly $15,000 of HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, which she had disguised as administrative costs for the curling club project. In August, Debra Patterson was charged with theft by embezzlement and fraud. The charges carried potential penalties of up to 10 years in prison and substantial fines. Her trial took place in November. I was called as a witness to describe the pattern of harassment and the events leading up to the ice incident. Michael testified about her financial misconduct. Multiple HOA members testified about improper procedures and unauthorized spending. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. In December, Debra was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution of $75,000 to the HOA. Standing in that courtroom, watching her being led away by the bailiff, I felt no satisfaction, just exhaustion and a bit of sadness for how completely out of control everything had gotten. The following spring, with Debra in prison and the legal matters mostly resolved, things finally started to calm down. The Lakeview Estates HOA was indeed dissolved, replaced by a voluntary neighborhood association with no enforcement powers and no mandatory fees. The curling club structure was dismantled, and the equipment was sold to help pay off the HOA's debts. I removed my heating system from the ice as ordered, though by that point it was May and the ice had melted naturally anyway. I reinforced my property boundaries with clear signage and planted a row of shrubs along the property line that would make the boundary visible year-round. Several of my neighbors made efforts to apologize for how things had gone. Tom Williams became a good friend, and we started having coffee once a week to talk about lake conditions and local news. He told me that the experience had taught the neighborhood a hard lesson about letting one person have too much unchecked power. The families who had fallen through the ice recovered fully, though I still felt guilty every time I thought about it. I could have hurt or killed people with my reckless plan. The fact that I had been provoked didn't change that. By the time the next winter rolled around and the lake froze again, I found myself looking at the ice differently. What had once been a source of simple joy was now complicated by memories of conflict and danger. But slowly, as the months passed, I started to reclaim it. I went skating on the cove again, carefully checking the ice thickness first, something I should have been more rigorous about before. The cove was peaceful in winter, with only the sound of the wind and the occasional crack of settling ice. It reminded me why I had bought this property in the first place. One February afternoon, about 2 years after the whole mess started, I was skating when I saw a family standing at the edge of the HOA's former property, watching me. A father, mother, and 2 kids, maybe 8 and 10 years old. They looked wistful. I skated over to them. "Can I help you?" The father looked embarrassed. "Sorry, we were just watching. We moved here last summer and heard there used to be skating on the lake. Is it safe?" I thought about it for a moment. Then I said, "The ice on my cove is safe. I check it regularly. Your kids are welcome to skate here if they'd like. Just let me know when you're coming so I can verify conditions." The mother's face lit up. Really? That's so kind of you. Over the next few weeks, several families started coming to skate on my cove. I set up a simple system. People would text me, I would check the ice and confirm it was safe, and then they could come use it. No fees, no organized activities, just neighbors sharing a resource. It wasn't a curling club, but it was something better. It was a community resource built on respect and communication, rather than force and entitlement. Tom Williams mentioned to me one evening that the old HOA leadership, the ones who had supported Debra, had mostly moved away, unable or unwilling to stay in a neighborhood where they were so universally disliked. New families had moved in, people who had heard about the drama but were looking for a fresh start. The neighborhood's better now, Tom said. More relaxed. People look out for each other instead of trying to control each other. I agreed. The property line between my land and the former HOA development was still there, clearly marked, but it felt less like a battlefield and more like what it should have been all along, just a line on a map. The curling stones that had sunk to the bottom of the lake were eventually recovered the following summer by a professional diving service. The HOA's insurance company paid for the recovery, hoping to resell the stones to recoup some of their losses. As it turned out, the stones had been damaged by their time in the cold water, and they were worth only a fraction of their original value. There was something poetic about that, I thought. All of that money, all of that conflict, all of that pain and struggle, and in the end the precious stones that had caused so much trouble were just broken pieces of granite at the bottom of a lake. I kept one of the stones. The diving company let me buy it for $50, damaged as it was. I put it in my yard near the path down to the cove with a little plaque that read, "Property Line." It served as a reminder of what happens when people forget where boundaries lie, both physical and ethical. My lawyer, Sarah Chen, sent me her final bill in March of the third year after everything started. The total legal fees had come to just over $90,000. Combined with the settlement money, the entire ordeal had cost me nearly $250,000. But I still had my house, my property, and my peace of mind. Debra Patterson, on the other hand, lost everything. Her marriage, her reputation, her freedom, and her future. Sometimes late at night, I wondered if I could have handled things differently. If I had just let them use the cove for curling, would any of this have happened? But then, I remembered that it was never really about curling. It was about someone who believed that what they wanted was more important than other people's rights. If I had given in on the curling club, there would have been something else. Another demand, another encroachment, another fight. People like Debra don't stop when you give them what they want. They just ask for more. The criminal cases against Michael Patterson and the two other men who had vandalized my property had been resolved with plea deals. They each paid fines and did community service, and their records would be expunged after a few years of good behavior. Michael had been genuinely apologetic, and I didn't see any point in pushing for harsher penalties. As I sit here now, 4 years after that morning when I first saw construction workers on my ice, I can look back with more perspective. The whole situation was absurd. A dispute over frozen water escalated into lawsuits, arrests, injuries, and ultimately, a prison sentence. But it also taught me something about standing your ground, about the importance of clear boundaries and the dangers of letting them be eroded bit by bit, about how quickly things can spiral when one side refuses to accept reasonable limits. The cove is frozen again this winter. The ice is thick and clear, nearly 14 inches in places. Several families are out there right now, skating in circles, laughing as kids learn to keep their balance. The afternoon sun makes the snow-covered mountains around Flathead Lake glow pink and orange. I grab my skates and head down to join them. The ice is solid beneath my feet, honest ice, formed naturally and checked carefully. There are no curling stones, no HOA disputes, no midnight vandalism. Just a frozen cove, a beautiful Montana winter afternoon, and the sound of people enjoying something simple and good, built on respect instead of entitlement. That's what it should have been all along.